1470 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 22 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. It's interesting when you look at books to realize that a lot of times when we read things, for some reason, if it's in print, we believe it, right? Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
And when it's in print in a book, an actual book, as opposed to a newspaper or a magazine, I don't know. It somehow has a little bit heavier weight, I guess, as far as whether we believe it or not. I don't know if what I just said is true. It seems like it's been true, though. Daniel Kalder wrote this book called The Infernal Library. This is an interesting look at the works of people like Hitler, for example, or any dictator, for example, that has written a book or poetry or even a novel, and the way that has affected maybe not their career in a political way, but just affected what they were doing and who they were. Daniel Kalder is a journalist, a contributor to the Dallas Morning News, The Guardian, The Times, Esquire, the BBC, and the subtitle of The Infernal Library is On Dictators, the Books They Wrote, and Other Catastrophes of Literacy. Daniel Kalder, good morning, sir. It's an honor to have you on our show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm actually calling from Austin, Texas. My accent may not suggest that, but
yeah, you sound a little further west than south, but that's okay.
Yeah. I'm from Scotland originally.
Oh, okay. So too far west. So tell me about this. How did this become a fascination to the point that you decided to write a book about it?
So I lived. So I said I'm from Scotland originally, but in the mid-90s I moved to Russia, and I lived there for about 10 years. And this was just after the collapse of communism. And at the time I rented apartments, and there was a lot of the kind of junk of communism was still lying around. And one of these things was I would rent apartments that still had the collected works of the dictators on the shelves of the people who lived there. So there might be Lenin on the shelves, and there was one apartment I rented where they still had books by Stalin, and they were kind of covered in dust. And this, so I kind of thought, well, I knew it was a phenomenon, but I thought it was maybe a dead phenomenon. But then in the early 2000s, I discovered that Saddam Hussein had just published a romance novel called Zabiba and the King, and it was a historical romance novel. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I got a copy, and I read it, and it was extremely bad, but bad in interesting ways. It was clear it wasn't written by a ghostwriter. This was his words. And so I thought, oh, so this is maybe still a living tradition. And so then I started kind of going deep into the past, and so I found practically every dictator in the 20th century had written, if not one book, then many, many books. And the books had been very important to their regimes, so they would force people to read them. They were almost like sacred texts. And yet, you know, once the regimes collapse, these books disappear. But it doesn't mean that they're not significant or they haven't had this impact throughout history. So
really?
I kind of wrote a few articles. Yeah, so I wrote a few articles for the Guardian, and then I just kind of jumped in and did many years of research.
So talk about the synchronization of the writing. Does the writing always seem to reflect what the person was known for, or does it sometimes contradict what the person is known for?
Well, that's a good question. So, and sometimes it absolutely reflects what they're known for. So, especially if you read like Hitler or Mussolini. Mein Kampf is kind of amazing because it's exactly what you expect it to be. It's a kind of hate-filled rant that just goes on and on and on and on. It's really difficult to read. And so Hitler didn't even conceal what he was trying to do. Mussolini, you know, he's nowhere near as extreme as Hitler, but he talks kind of lovingly about violence and the power of violence and force. So they were really explicit. But some other mass murderers, like Stalin, for example, his stuff, or Chairman Mao, their stuff is aggressively boring. So it's not about, oh, let's, conquer the world. It's very theoretical. It's very dry. It's kind of steeped in Marxist kind of language. So they're almost concealing. You know, there's no way you can read like guys like that, and
Right.
and it covers what they were really doing in those regimes. So some of them are explicit, and some of them hide what was going on.
Okay, I have heard. I've never read Mein Kampf, but I've heard that it is extremely boring and very poorly written. How did it ever become published?
So it was, well, yeah, and even Hitler admitted he wasn't a writer. He said, "I am not a writer." Years later, he wished he hadn't done it because his main skill was speech. So it was like he was in prison and he had nothing to do, and so he dictated it to one of his kind of assistants. And then they published it once he was released. And there was a sort of Nazi publisher. So I think they tried to kind of get it into a mainstream publisher.
Okay.
But it just wound up going through like a Nazi publisher from his own party.
So the publisher kind of was on the same wavelength as far as socially and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't sell many copies to begin with. It was only, once he was in power, he was able to kind of force people to read it or, get it in everybody's hand.
Well, you'd have thought that there would have been some clues about Hitler. I mean, Time magazine made his face on the cover, Man of the Year.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's abundant clues. They're not even clues. He's screaming at you.
Yeah,
like what he's going to, what he's about. But at the same time, there was a lot of ranting lunatics. I think every age has these marginal figures who have really extreme opinions, and so people just ignored them because they didn't think it would lead to what happened. I think that, and that's the thing with all these books. Many of the people who wrote them, many of these dictators started off as writers or underground revolutionaries, but they had tiny followings. So they were talking about what they wanted to do, but people just ignored them because they were like kind of lunatics on the internet today. And then it was only when it was too late that they kind of realized what was going on.
And some of them were poets.
Some of them were, so like Stalin, as a teenager he wrote poetry. It was published in very prestigious magazines, so he apparently was quite good, but then he gave up to become a revolutionary. And Chairman Mao, who's the Chinese dictator, he wrote poetry through his entire career. But Chinese emperors wrote poetry, so he was working in a tradition that was like thousands of years old. And Ho Chi Minh, he wrote poetry. I think his poetry is actually better than Chairman Mao's. It's a bit more personal. So yeah, they did all kinds of stuff. And Saddam Hussein wrote a novel. Mussolini wrote a novel. General Franco wrote a kind of screenplay novel. So some of them attempted to be creative.
Really? So what was their goal? Was it to become a writer? Was it to influence the masses, or was it to get have a career as a writer? I don't know.
I think they were always primarily keen on power. So a lot of these dictators, they started out as writers. They were writers before they were dictators, and writers can have big egos, and maybe it requires a degree of self-confidence to tell things as they are. So, Lenin was a writer for a good 20 years before he had power. Mussolini, the same, and they would they could control the page, so they would explore their theories on the page. And then, historical events were such that suddenly they found themselves able to seize power. So, very often, I think they always desired power, but in the absence of power, they would just fantasize and write and exercise power in their own parties. So power was central, but the control of the word was also key to controlling people's thoughts and controlling people's minds.
Yeah.
And,
I want to talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to kind of throw you a curveball and put you kind of in a maybe awkward position. I'm going to ask you to try to answer this one. Could it happen today? We have such instant ways to criticize. Like if a book comes out today and it's along the lines of something a dictator might have written, while that person might have a following, I think there's going to be so much pushback from those who can post on social media that it probably would die right away. Although I don't know, does it still happen today?
It kind of depends. So I would say, for example, when I started writing this book, Gaddafi was still alive, Castro was still alive, and it looked like the dictators were on their last legs. And then, the Arab Spring happened, and social media was central to the Arab Spring. And it was, so Mubarak in Egypt was kind of brought down and people organized, and then the same thing happened in Iran. People went out on the streets. And so there was this kind of feeling of hope that it wasn't possible. But if you look in those countries now, the Arab Spring's pretty much gone, except maybe in Tunisia. But, in Egypt, they have a very strong authoritarian leader. In Turkey, Erdogan is a very strong authoritarian leader. In Russia, we have a very strong authoritarian leader. And, they have social media. They have all the stuff we have, but they can control it, or they can kind of activate their own online mobs to do their bidding and kind of persecute people. And in China, Xi Jinping, basically, when this book was published, the very week it was published, it was announced he was now going to be leader for life. So in some countries, social media hasn't, maybe they're more subtle than they used to be. So, in Russia, they have elections, they're managed elections, but they can still kind of get what they want through. And then, in Western democracies, I think it's a bit tougher, because I think there's much stronger defenses against it.
Right.
But even then, if you look at the countries where this happened, where the dictatorships emerged in the 20th century, it was Germany. Germany was one of the most advanced countries in the world prior to Hitler. China was ancient civilization. Russia was, it was an autocracy, but it had very advanced science. So these are some of the greatest nations on earth, and everybody was caught off guard. Nobody was expecting it.
The dictators, by definition, were wanting to rule the world. I guess that's a broad statement, but in general, I guess. And they also, in many ways, wanted to ban certain books. The Bible, of course, is one of them. Did they want their books to replace the Bible? Did they want whatever the Bible was doing for the people who followed that? Did they ever try, and are they still trying to, replace doctrine with other doctrine that would almost put them in the place of being a god in a way?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's key to understanding the phenomenon of dictators and these books. Is they were keen on absolute power, and so like a kind of alternative, and they were keen on their version of reality, their moral codes, and so in communism it was aggressively atheistic. And so the churches were, and mosques, every religion was severely persecuted, because the leader was like a new prophet, and the leader had a new message that would bring about sort of paradise on earth. And so they kind of pushed the kind of traditional sacred texts to the side, and then their books became sort of alternative sacred texts, and everybody was kind of forced to read them. If you went to university in the Soviet Union, you had to pass exams on Lenin. If you wanted to have a good career, you had to, even as a chemist or a scientist, you had to know their thoughts and their words. And this kind of cuts across practically all dictatorships. So very much so. They wanted to, and then they create these personality cults. And so everywhere you would look, and I traveled in one Asian country called Turkmenistan, and their dictator had a really insane personality cult like you see in North Korea. And everywhere you look, you're reminded of the leader. So there's like statues, there's posters, they're on TV all the time. And so they're kind of ubiquitous like a god. And they try to be like kind of living gods. But, it always fails. There was
a story this weekend in the New York Times about Xi Jinping. I don't know if he's a what do you call him, president? I don't know what he is over in China.
I would just call him an authoritarian leader right now. I don't think he's gone full dictator, but he's certainly centralizing a lot of power in his own hands.
Yeah, and he banned the sale of the online Bible. So right now you can tell he's trying to do the same thing. Has he written a book?
Yeah, he has, and that's a very, and so again, I think also things like the Bible or any religion is an alternative reading of reality, and they have strong moral codes. And so these are like a challenge to leaders, so they must control or ban or outlaw these texts.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping, so when I wrote the book, he was just going to be gone after like 2 terms. But he had been quietly publishing books. So he has like 2 great big books on the governance of China. He has a book on his youth. And so he's been kind of quietly publishing these, and now, these are distributed all across China, sold in the millions. They get wonderful reviews. And that was like 50 years ago.
Right.
That's what Chairman Mao was doing. So he's following like a really strong tradition in that regard.
So do you have, or do we have? Oh no, the books. Do the books have followers today, like new people who never picked up the books we're talking about? Are they picking them up today and still being brainwashed by the content of those books?
I'd say Mein Kampf, above all, Mein Kampf definitely does. So I'd say, Mein Kampf has a very unhealthy afterlife. I mean, it's all over the internet. And I think in Turkey, it was a bestseller about a few years ago. You can find it in the Middle East. And I even read it, I think it was in maybe India. They were reading it as a business manual. It was like, this is not like how to conquer the world, but how to do business, how to conquer your competitors.
Holy cow, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and wow. I think that was a BBC report. So maybe they're not being read. Sometimes it's read as it was intended, but even if you think if you're, I mean, Hitler viewed everybody who was non-German as a subhuman, and certainly people in Asia he regarded this as this kind of really. Despite this, people still read this book, and of course it has an audience, all over the world, more or less. So him more than others, but I would say, I mean, Chairman Mao in China is officially still revered. So you're still, people pay lip service to his books. The kind of the Russian communists, not so much. I mean, I think they had a historical impact that is still felt, especially in some of the post-Soviet states. They're maybe not reading those books, but they're trying to create new books to do the same job. But I don't think there's a lot of people reading Stalin nowadays. I mean, I know Mussolini still has some kind of small following in Italy.
But then you have the cult leaders. I mean, you have the Jones years ago that killed over 200 people because they followed him, and then you've got the Charles Mansons of the world. They're not interested in running their country or the whole world, just their own tiny piece of it, and people are following them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels there because, a Jim Jones is a totalitarian leader. He really wants to control the minds, thoughts, and souls of his followers, or David Koresh, or a lot of these guys, and they kind of close people off, keep them in these closed communities, and then control what they have access to, what they think. They do all this, and this is on a small scale. What happens on a very large scale in totalitarian societies? They also seal the borders, control the media, control what people read, tell them what to think. So I think that kind of personality type, the totalitarian personality type, it can manifest itself in different ways. So sometimes you see it in these cult leaders, sometimes you see it in religious political leaders on a much larger scale. But I think it's absolutely correct that there's parallels between that. So maybe here in America, that's the experience is more on that small scale of these cult leaders, but I think that they're very similar to these characters like Saddam Hussein or whoever.
Kim Jong-un is obviously influenced by Kim Jong-il. I can't remember the relationship. Is that his grandfather?
So he's the third generation. So Kim Il-sung was the first. He's the grandfather. Kim Jong-il was the son, and now Kim Jong-un is the grandfather. So he's a third generation dictator.
And whenever you hear about somebody from North Korea escaping or whatever, they don't have happy things to say. So it's almost like we force them, or they force them to read the books or follow the doctrine. Does that seem accurate?
Yeah, they do. And it's kind of interesting because in North Korea, that's 3 generations of misery in that country. And you're sort of fed propaganda, everything's going to be great. But I think another function of propaganda is, maybe it can humiliate people. So even if they know it's not true, they're forced to repeat these lies. And I think maybe some people believe it, but everybody has to participate. And so it's a way of, I think, it demoralizes people and sort of humiliates them, and it helps keep them subjugated. So it has multiple uses.
So is that the hope for you in writing this book? Is it to kind of show the truth about these guys?
Yeah, I think to kind of, so a lot of this, very few people read these books because they're not pleasant to read.
Right.
But I think it's really important because they had a huge impact on history, and they continue to do so. And as you know, there's new ones emerging, and I think we should never think, oh, it's okay, the dictators are gone, we live in a new era, because we can see there's authoritarians popping up all the time. And so I think to be wary and to be alert, and also to be grateful for when you don't live in one of these societies, that, you know, we have protections and constitutional protections, and we, you know, they weren't come by easily. They were come by hard.
That's right.
And so, you know, we should be kind of grateful and for them, and then defend them, and realize they're really valuable, because if you live in one of these places, it's a terrible thing.
Well, that's awesome. I have a copy of the book. If I have a listener who would like it, call me right now. I'll leave it here for you at the radio station. The rest of us have to go buy it. I did find it on Amazon, where, by the way, you're doing very well. Number 11 in one category. That's not too bad. Daniel, give us a website that might, in addition to the Amazon.
Yeah, so I have my own site, www.danielkalder.com, Calder with a K. And, you know, it's in all the bookshops, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever. But there's more information on my website. Okay,
excellent. And we'll put this this interview online. It'll be up there by 2 o'clock today. Daniel Kalder, thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
You're welcome. We will be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. Protests and some cheers for Bill Cosby at the start of his retrial on sexual assault charges in Pennsylvania.
Hey, hey, hey! Women's lives matter!
Police tackled and arrested that topless woman who charged Cosby when he arrived at the courthouse. She got a few feet away from him.
This is one of the first high-profile cases to be prosecuted after the Me Too movement took down a number of A-list Hollywood men.